Jess and I had a bit of a conversation earlier today about how this might go, and we both agreed that it would be appropriate to start with the first picture, which is a self-portrait. So I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much, Brian, for the introduction. Thank you all for coming. Can you hear me? Okay, you can come a little closer if you like. It's not too scary. But thank you so much for coming tonight. I really appreciate everyone being here, and I am thrilled to be here at CLAMP and have this work up in New York. As a bit of background about the project and series, this is an exhibition called Look at Me Like You Love Me. It's a selection of newer work from a long-term project that I've been working on since 2011 called Every Breath We Drew. And this work really centers around the intersection between how we come to know ourselves and our own intimate identity, and how we connect with others on an intimate level, on a meaningful level. So I'm thinking a lot about issues of personhood, thinking about existential questions, which we can double down on in some of the other pictures, thinking about what it means to be in a relationship, and thinking about how our most core inner selves are often reflected back at us or validated to us through relationships with other people. I'm interested in all kinds of relationships: platonic, romantic, familial, communal. So when I say intimacy and connection, I'm thinking of it on this very large level. All of my work as an artist, I work primarily in portraiture. This is some newer deviation that I'm excited about. But I've worked primarily in portraiture, and my work really comes from my own identity and my own experience in the world. It's very informed by who I am, which includes my identity as a queer person and as someone who identifies as non-binary. So there are themes of gender throughout the work. There are themes of sexuality. Brian and I were talking about this earlier. But the work, this body of work, is really more about what it means to be a person and all of the complexities that go into that. We wanted to start with a self-portrait because in many ways I think of this body of work as an extended self-portrait, because my choice of subjects is very subjective. The people that I choose to photograph are sometimes friends, sometimes people I'm very close to. My partner Vanessa, who's here, is in the work as well. So some very close relationships. My mom is in other work. She's here as well. Some people I photograph repeatedly over an extended period of time. Colin, who's behind you, is someone I've worked with a lot. And Oscar back there, who we can talk about, is someone I photographed over a period of many years, developing really deep relationships with a lot of trust to collaborate together. But some people are people that I just met in passing, and I was drawn to them because of a quality they had in themselves, because of a kind of energy I felt with them, because I was interested to see what would happen when I looked at that person and how they would look at me. So the portraits are very much about what happens between me and someone else, and that reflection back. There are a lot of literal self-portraits in the body of work as well. I've photographed myself throughout my career, and as I've gotten older, the work has changed a little bit, but I've always felt that it's really important to include myself in my own work because it implicates me as part of the community that I'm working within. It shares my own identity and my own experiences with the viewer. And I've also found that by sharing my own story really intimately, it opens up a space for other people to share with me. And this is a really important part of my work and that exchange. It's very much about a kind of storytelling, and it's about a need and a desire to be seen as who you are, as your authentic self, and to be validated and affirmed as that self. So there are literal self-portraits, which you're probably wondering why I'm not talking about this picture yet. But in this body of work, the self-portraits are really important. In the book that accompanies it, which we have here, I began and ended with a self-portrait, and that was really to address head-on how subjective this work is and how much about me and my own subjectivities it really is. Interestingly, to me, in my earlier self-portraits, I often made eye contact with the viewer. In some ways, they were more confrontational. In some ways, they were more overtly about presenting my identity in terms of my gender or sexuality. And in the newer work, I feel that it's really taken a turn toward being more interior. I'm not making eye contact with the viewer in either of these self-portraits, actually in any of the self-portraits in the book. And for me, this is significant because I'm at a place in my life where I'm turning inward, I'm asking different questions. I'm not sort of figuring out who I am, but now I'm asking deeper questions about what does it mean to live in this life, and what does it mean to be in the relationships that I'm in. What does it mean to be a parent? What does it mean to be a spouse? What does it mean to be a friend? And so the self-portraits are really critical in that way.
You mentioned the incorporation of things other than portraits. The next two are more recent examples. Let's talk a little more about your ideas behind that.
Sure. Yeah, so I've always made some still life images. My earlier still life images were often pairs of things, like 2 pairs of boots or 2 pillows. And they were really meant to reference the need we all have for relationship and connection. And the newer ones took a bit of a turn. They feel different to me. I should say that this work is all very new. A lot of it was made during the pandemic, which we could talk about further, but it certainly affected the work. And the still life images do a couple things for me. They allow me to hit a certain kind of emotional note that it's sometimes harder for me to get at in a portrait. And I'm very much thinking of my work in sequence and in conversation. And I'm thinking of a series of photographs as a kind of a lyrical sequence, almost like music or a poem. So I'm interested in how some images hit different kinds of notes. And also, one thing that really deepened for me over the past couple years, largely due to the pandemic, as I'm sure many of you can understand and relate to, is there was this deepening around asking existential questions about what it meant to be alive, what it meant to connect with other people. And for me, some of the stills, especially the flowers, were a way of getting at this directly. I wasn't consciously thinking of that when I was making the work, but I think looking back, that was my way of processing this experience of isolation. I think there are themes of temporality in this work. I think a lot about things that are transient, things that won't last very long, things that are fleeting, things that are fluid, and I can talk about all of that more. But I think for me, the flower images kind of get at that. And we can talk about the quality of light too, and maybe that's useful in this one. But my photographs are very much about the light and the quality of the light. It's a huge influence. I am influenced by painting, and I spend a lot of time looking at color and light and gesture and pose. In an image like this, it's obviously almost exclusively about the color and the light. I'm thinking about the presence of a body without that body actually being there, the reference to human experience, but also how fleeting this moment is. And something that for me runs through this body of work, and it's pulled out pretty heavily in the book through an inclusion of writing, is there's a duality of beauty and sadness, or beauty and struggle. And I think this is rooted in some of my own experiences as a queer person and within queer communities. And for me, those two things go together because there can be a risk of loss or a risk of difficulty or an actual experience of something sad. But for me, the flip side of that is this desire like an urgent need to live in the present and to live authentically and to live fully. And so I realize I might have taken a turn, but for me, that's kind of what this is all getting at, this like urgency and a fleeting beauty and a like intense human connection. I've always made portraits, as I mentioned. I've often photographed within queer and trans communities, and one thing that is really significant to my work is queer representation, especially in the museum space, in printed space, and so that is very much a driving force of my work. I'm also really interested in couples, in relationships, and how people connect. A lot of my earlier work was made indoors. We were talking about this a little bit earlier. I would often go to someone's home or personal space. I would photograph them in their bedroom. I would photograph in this kind of private, quiet interior space. And even before the pandemic, I had begun to work outdoors. I started to be interested in the landscape. I was interested in having some more breathing room around the subject. I started to think about what it means to represent queer love or queer desire in an open, natural space as opposed to a private interior space. But then the pandemic hit, and it happened actually right as I was gearing up to make a lot of work for an exhibition in St. Louis. And I felt very frustrated because I couldn't go into anyone's home. I didn't photograph inside anyone's house for about a year and a half. And I found this incredibly frustrating at first. It was like right when I was going to hit the ground running and make all this, intentionally make work in a specific place. But what ended up happening is I had to seek out different locations. And that limitation ended up being incredibly productive. It led to a lot of the still life images because I was working in my own home. I thought I was bored of my home. I thought I'd made all the pictures I ever wanted to make in my home. And then during the pandemic, I discovered all kinds of new light patterns and things I hadn't really seen before. But this image was one that I very specifically found this location because I couldn't go to their home. This was a rooftop in St. Louis. It was actually the top of a friend's studio, and she offered for us to come use it. The Mississippi River's in the background. And we made this picture at the very last moment before the sunset. I'm really interested in photographing at sunrise and at sunset. I'm interested in it as an emotional device, like the quality of light and how it feels. I'm interested in it psychologically, the transience of that light. And then it's also just really beautiful. And of course, as a photographer, it also makes me work quickly, which I was appreciating. It forced me to be responsive as opposed to premeditating a portrait. So all of that is here in this picture for me. And I love the gesture of holding. I'm really interested in kind of claiming oneself, but also claiming one's desire or claiming love or claiming a relationship. There's a line in the book that says, "This is who I am and this is who I love." And I see that in a lot of the images of couples, this kind of assertion of a kind of pride, but also a kind of tenderness. I'm really interested in the duality of strength and tenderness and having those things together. So yeah, I love the way they're holding each other. I love this kind of interplay of their hands. Part of me looking at painting is that I spend a lot of time looking at hands and thinking about how hand gestures signify a certain kind of comfort or a certain kind of openness or a certain kind of relaxed nature. So you may notice I pay a lot of attention to like this specific hand gestures.
So some of your most recent work has been photographs of your family, and this is a good example of that. Tell us a little more about that work.
Sure, yeah. So I've been photographing my partner Vanessa, who seems to be hiding, since we met in 2012. And I've also been photographing my mom, who's here, who disappeared on me.
Over by the wall.
For much longer than that, but for about the same amount of time, I've been consistently making pictures of my family, and now that also includes my mom's partner, Chris, and our daughter, Eleanor, who's 4, so there's this element of parenting and queer families and a different kind of documenting of that. But throughout that whole time, images of Vanessa have also existed in this body of work. And of course, I'm thinking about intimacy and relationships and that kind of extended connection over time, extended relationship over time. And it's interesting because I have a separate body of work called Family Pictures, but pictures of Vanessa kind of float in and out of this body of work and that body of work. This was made, we were talking earlier about locations. This was made in Provincetown, Massachusetts, where I spend time every summer. This is right in front of a friend's home where we spend time as a family. And it's a place I love to photograph. I love the quality of light. I love the mood of the place. But also the role of water is really important to me in my work. I'm interested in water as a physical thing, as a place to make pictures. I'm interested in the kind of weightlessness that happens in water and the intimacy that happens in water. There are strong themes of water throughout this work, and especially in the book, they're pulled out pretty intensely. But I'm interested in water as this thing that is both solid and transient, especially the ocean. Thinking about this, how it's so steady and so grounding, but it's always in flux. So yeah, the role of water has taken on a kind of metaphorical place in a lot of the photographs.
And you were talking about series of work, and this is something I'm personally curious about. You do have discrete bodies of work, but everything seems a bit fluid. One series runs into another. And are there certain photographs that kind of feel like they belong in more than one body of work? Or do you think about them discretely?
No, that's an interesting question. I sometimes think that I make bodies of work almost in hindsight, because the way that I photograph is so constant and it's so connected to my life. I learn about myself by looking at my photographs. I learn like what questions I'm asking myself or what I'm interested in. So I have this process of photographing very intuitively, and then I try to keep the intellectualizing and the reflecting separate. But then I make time for that, and I look back and I think, like, what was I thinking about? What was interesting to me at that moment?
Yeah.
And what's interesting is this work, Every Breath We Drew, and the family work runs, so far an 11-year period. So those questions are changing, and also my what I'm interested in visually is shifting and changing. I call this project my soul work, like my long-term, ongoing photography practice. These images are the way that I relate to the world around me, and the way that I understand myself, and the way that I ground myself. So I very much view it as a lifelong project, and when I have an exhibition or a book, I think of it almost as putting parentheses around a section of the work, knowing that it will continue. And I think the family work is the same.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe in the family work, I'm interested in time, and I'm interested in the passage of time in all of my work. But in the family work, it's a really core element.
I want to talk about the other self-portrait. I think of the two self-portraits as sort of bookends of the exhibition, like the self-portraits are bookends in the monograph, because it does have some commonality with the photograph of Vanessa in that it was taken in Provincetown, and you're also thinking about water.
Yeah.
What else can you tell us about that particular picture?
Yeah, it's interesting. I definitely think of the self-portraits together. Like you said, they're the beginning and ending of the book. In a way, this picture feels, it's obviously darker, it's heavier, it's very interior. To me, that feels like a psychologically complicated portrait. There's something in this one that feels really hopeful to me, and really positive, and really kind of open to the world. Yes, this image was made in the Bay in Provincetown really early in the morning, 7 a.m. Vanessa's smiling. I think she wants me to tell you she pressed the shutter. So Vanessa helped me, and my tripod was sinking and moving, and I think we had a coffee cup that we kept moving with the tide. It was like a whole thing. But to me, that gesture, that opening, that kind of giving yourself over to the universe, to the world, to the energy, however you think of that, feels really meaningful to me. And it feels like a grounded pose that's also open. Interestingly, that's also me kind of referencing myself, because I made a picture. My first book ends with a picture in that same pose from 2014, and this was from 2021. So there is kind of a revisiting of my own life and experience, and kind of re-embodying a pose and seeing how that feels. Yeah.
Wonderful. The next image on the wall is actually the cover of the monograph. And you mentioned to me that this was initially a picture that didn't even make the edit. How did that change and come about?
Yeah, so this is Oscar, and this is Zach, who he's with. And Oscar's someone I photographed extensively over about a 3-year period. We're actually going to make some pictures next week, so I'm continuing to photograph him. But sometimes I just find a kind of magic with someone, and we just work really well together, and so we kind of keep pursuing that relationship, and Oscar's one of those people for sure. So when I was editing the book, it was actually a problem of having too many Oscar pictures, I had too many Oscar, and I had too many of Colin, who's laying in the violets, because he's another person I photographed over and over and over. And so this one I had actually edited out, not because I didn't like it, but out of necessity of, I think there's still 5 of Oscar in the book. And then when I was working on the book with Mac, we needed an image that was kind of an outtake to use as the signature plate in the back, and I sent them this image, and they immediately designed it as the cover. And it was clear to all of us that it was the right cover. It just clicked. They had actually initially designed the cover with my blue self-portrait, and it wasn't quite right. And when they tried it with this, it just totally worked and fit the spirit of the work, and fit the title, Look at Me Like You Love Me, and this kind of, call to be seen, and a desire to be affirmed and in relationship, and it all was kind of in this image. So yeah, it originally wasn't going to be in the book, and then it ended up on the cover.
So I think I'm going to give you the opportunity to choose which picture you would like to talk about to end things. But before we get to that, and then we'll open up for questions, I don't want to embarrass you, but can you talk about all the other shows you have up right now?
Sure, yeah. So currently I have an exhibition at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. And some friends are here from Boston, which is lovely. And it's called Coupled. It's an exhibition of 20 by 24 Polaroid images I actually made between 2006 and 2008, just on the heels of the legalization of same-sex marriage there. I made them during and after my time as an undergraduate student. And they're all queer couples. So it's 20 Polaroids of queer couples. And the Museum of Fine Arts Boston acquired the body of work and has half of them up as an exhibition right now. So that's going on in Boston. I have the debut presentation of family pictures up at the National Portrait Gallery in a group show called Kinship. We have the catalog around the corner. It's 8 artists who look at their family, and that's going to be up for 14 months. So it's a long run if you're in DC. I have another exhibition of this work at a museum in Kansas. It's called the Nerman Museum of Contemporary Art that will be up through May. And then a different body of work called To Survive on the Shore, which focuses on transgender older adults, is currently up at the Newcomb Museum at Tulane in New Orleans. And it's opening at the SFO Museum at the San Francisco Airport and will be up through June.
And is the show at the Akron Art Museum already down?
No.
Oh, okay.
So the Akron Art Museum, and this is maybe important, I just released a selection of work from family pictures more broadly. I've been holding it back because I really wanted to give the work time to develop. And over the summer, I made a selection of that work public the first 10 years. And the Akron Art Museum acquired 5 pieces for their collection, and they have them up in the permanent collection galleries.
Wonderful. Cool. Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you.
So why don't you choose one more picture that you have something to tell us about, and then we'll open things up for questions.
Sure, I'm trying to decide. I probably shouldn't talk about anything back there. Let's see. Maybe I'll talk about Jamie, actually. So Jamie is in the bathtub there in the center, the vertical photograph. And she's someone that I got to know in St. Louis, where I live, and became a friend of mine. And, most often when I find people to photograph, it's me approaching them, asking them to make their picture. In the case of Jamie, she approached me and asked if I would document her body because she had breast cancer and had had one of her breasts removed, but found it physically uncomfortable and knew she was going to go back and have a second surgery. And she approached me and asked if I would photograph her throughout this process. And that started a relationship of us working together for several years. And this was actually the first picture we made together, when you can see she had one surgery, but not the other. And I just love the openness in her, and I love the strength and ownership of her body in that image. And if you see the book, she appears quite a few more times. There are some of her with her partner, and then there are some of her, after that second surgery. But that relationship became particularly meaningful.
It's interesting when you were talking about how you work in terms of ongoing themes versus, discrete series. I started thinking about Nan Goldin, who kind of works in a similar sort of way.
Yeah.
And then looking at this image of a bathtub, and bathtubs are recurring themes in Goldin's work as well.
Yeah.
It's interesting because stylistically the work couldn't be more different, but in terms of subject and spirit, there are some similarities. Is that anyone who ever influenced you?
Sure, of course, yeah. And I think that there is similarity in terms of pulling from one's own life and community. I was actually just talking about her the other day because I think it was from her I was talking about it in terms of my working editing process, because when I photograph, and you said people want to know what I photograph with, right? Maybe I should say that.
Yeah, there are
We could-
many artists in
Camera.
the room, so that could be of interest.
But when I
yeah.
photograph, I trained on a 4x5 view camera, which I used for 10 years. And for the past 10, I've used a medium format digital camera, which I love, and I still work in the same way. It's on a tripod. I use all natural light. I use slow shutter speeds. I do a lot of directing. There's a lot of collaboration between me and the subject. But the reason I brought up my equipment now is because I was just talking to someone about Nan Goldin and how I read once that she would make photographs and then she would just sort of organize them prints in boxes by themes. And after a certain amount of time, like the box would be a body of work. And in a way, like when I work, I'm always photographing and I'm always making these 8x10 proof prints, and then I'm looking at them and reflecting on them and I'm putting them in the box. I have, family box and Every Breath We Drew box, and and then when I 3 or 4 years pass, I go back and kind of look through this body of work. So I think in that way I learned that from her, but also maybe the similarity is this kind of constant photographing, constantly photographing from your life and then kind of making sense of that as a body of work.
Yeah, and then Golden has gone back after decades and kind of re-edited work and put different pictures together. And I anticipate that may be something that you'll be doing, decades to come too.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm sure some of you here probably have specific questions too, so feel free to speak up.
Just want to shout out, you're still in one show for another week. Designing Motherhood is at the Mass Art Gallery, and that was at the Luder and will go on because it's traveling. It's beautiful.
Can you repeat
Right, yeah,
that?
to repeat, I have a piece from the Family Project actually featuring me and Vanessa 2 days after our daughter was born, holding her in the hospital. It's up at the Mass Art Museum in a show called Designing Motherhood, which is a really powerful show. It's not only an art show. It has all kinds of objects and archival materials and research around reproduction and everything related to that. So it's a very compelling exhibition, and it's traveling to the Gates Foundation in Seattle, where it will be up for a long time, a year, I think. Thanks for reminding me.
Go ahead.
Is there a particular image that was difficult to take, maybe because of the coordinating or whatever it is, whatever it might be?
Oh, thanks. That's a good question. For all of my portraits, I have a process of essentially working my way into the image. And it's something I can only do by looking through the camera in real time with the person and looking at the light in real time. And sometimes things come easily. Oscar's sort of a dream. He's very easy to work with and can often quickly fall in. We quickly find pictures together. But sometimes it takes a long time. Actually, in this room, the most difficult image was my blue self-portrait. For some reason that day, it just was hard for me. The self-portraits are harder for me to make anyway because I'm not able, there's more trial and error. I'm not looking through the camera as I'm photographing. And so I'm simultaneously trying to create a photograph and have a real emotional experience in front of the camera. I like to make them alone. Vanessa was with me for the one outside, but I'm often alone when I'm making those. And that one, I think, took me 3 hours. It was really long. And I just wasn't getting it right, but I loved the light and I loved the space. And it was almost like I had to wear myself out, like I was overperforming. And, I finally got to this point where I was just so tired and everything kind of came together. I normally spend about an hour making a portrait, so that was really long. And I'm often tired after I make pictures. I'm often really thirsty too for some reason. I'm tired and I need 4 glasses of water. But that one was really difficult. And but I was happy I stuck with it. I ended up being really, really pleased.
And that kind of relates to a question that I had that I haven't asked you yet, and it's about the process of shooting the portraits. How much direction is there in terms of pose and the tilt of the head and the expression? Because there really is a commonality, between a lot of the portraits. But I've never heard you talk about that.
Yeah, sure. So I do a decent amount of directing. as you can see, my photographs are very formal, so there's a lot of collaboration required, a lot of, sort of fine-tuning of a kind of pose. But it often starts with a much more general question, like, if you were standing here talking to me, how would you hold your body? Or if you leaned on that wall, what would you do? Or if you laid on that bed, how would you lay down? So it's me really trying to find a pose that is responsive to the person I'm photographing and comes from them, but also that's visually interesting. And then there's the process of me making small adjustments, like tilt your head this way, and sometimes I say very small things like put your weight on one foot, and it just changes someone's body. But I do a lot of directing, and we certainly choose, we choose the location together, but then I fine tune around color and light, and sometimes I'll say to someone, stand over here, I need to see how the light looks on you. It's like, oh no, that's not good, try over here. So it's this process of figuring it out together. But ultimately, I view it as me directing each person into an authentic version of who they are, that's also visually interesting for the camera. So I'm not interested in people kind of playing a part. I'm really trying to get at something that at least I see as unique to them, or kind of getting at the essence of who they are. Yeah.
Oh. Yeah.
Yeah.
When you are finding your models, what kind of communities do you find yourself in? Where are they coming from?
So what sort of communities are you finding your models from? Yeah.
That's a great question. Some are my close friends and people I've known for a long time. A lot of it, honestly, has been my communities in St. Louis, where I live, both queer communities and creative communities, art communities. Sometimes there are things like, I mentioned going to Provincetown every summer. I teach there at the Fine Arts Work Center, and I often meet people to photograph there. That's how Kai and I met and made pictures together. So it's really just my life, like where I go and where I spend time and who I'm around, and that tends to be, queer communities and creative communities.
Oh. Yeah, sure.
Dark self-portrait, did you add any light? I mean, was that, clearly there's a light, but is that something that was on the street, or did you add it?
So
it's a question about lighting. I'm sorry, I'm just for the video.
No,
Yeah.
perfect. So that's all natural light. It was just one window, and it was daylight. That's a kind of unusual location. The blue one is at a hotel in St. Louis called the Dugan Artist Hotel, where you book a room based on the color. So you can pick a blue room, a red room, a yellow room, or a green room. And in person, they're a bit much, I think. But I kind of tone them down, and I was really interested in just the light and the color.
So you were indoors?
That's indoors, yeah.
Interesting, it looks outdoors.
No, so that's indoors, and just to the left of the frame is a window. But I did not add any light. I work with all natural light, and I occasionally add a reflector. It's about as crazy as it gets. Yeah.
Is there much you do post-production?
Not a lot. I do post-production in Photoshop, and I'm not like some 100% purist. Like I'll take out a nail on a wall or something irritating, but I do very little post-production. It's really akin to what you could do in a darkroom, color, levels, contrast, but not much. And I don't do any cropping. It's all in the camera. Yeah.
All right.
As
so go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, as a couple people here know, I trained at Mass Art in Boston, which was very large format, everything in camera, very intentional when you're photographing. And so that really stuck with me.
All right. So maybe one more before we turn on the air conditioner and have something to drink.
I had the pleasure of singing to Survive on the Shore at the Cafe Moon Gallery, and I'm fairly familiar with Chicago, and I live there. I believe you shot most of those people in Uptown.
So To Survive on the Shore was actually made throughout the United States.
Was it? Okay, I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah.
Mostly in Chicago. So my question is, could you tell me a little bit about how you got to know some of your subjects in that, because I thought it was a phenomenal body of work.
Oh, thank you. Sure. Yeah. So, To Survive on the Shore was a project I worked on from 2013 to 2018. It was actually in collaboration with Vanessa, who's a social worker and researcher focused on LGBTQ communities and aging. And we photographed and interviewed 88 people throughout the United States. And we found them through a variety of ways. Some was our own communities, some was word of mouth, some was outreach through the press. We had some press in the New York Times that really spread the word about the project. More grassroots outreach, like going to trans conferences, reaching out to nonprofit organizations. So that one was really a multi-pronged approach, and differs from this work in that we were seeking people based on their identity and demographics, as opposed to this work, which is so much about like my own emotional response to someone.
And one thing I didn't realize is that's how you and Vanessa met, was collaborating on that?
We had met just prior.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
cool.
We had met the year before and then launched a project together.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
great.
We met country line dancing at a gay bar in Chicago.
And we will have line dancing after this. So. All right, well, thank you, everyone. The turnout is wonderful.